Hello everyone, today I discuss a topic that I really wanted to from quite some time. That is to say, how important is it for a YouTube history channel to make its sources, historical sources, explicit, right? And how this varies depending on the circumstances. Now, I've never had a problem actually after more than 1 million views. I think the exception that confirms the rule is, now that I think about it, couple of years ago, like one of these random bypassers saying, "Oh, but this video doesn't have sources," right? So, meaning, fortunately, that the person never stuck around to comment anymore, at least. And I realized that there are some concerns regarding to this, not again specifically for Schwerpunkt in my experience, but on the internet as a whole. Now, from just 1 month or so, I began to browse some of the content, like not really watching the videos, but, I mean, sometimes, but compared to the ones I'm just really being impressed, like YouTube says, like, the number of impressions, that is to say, how many times that video comes under your eyes, basically. Of course, I never watch, I can't freely say, I don't have the time, etc. But it helped me, right, assessing, first of all, that the situation is much worse than I thought about YouTube history output in the first place, like in these years of isolationism. I said, well, probably there is someone talking history outside of here, and it's, I say, of Schwerpunkt, of course, and it's comparable, it's something thought-provoking, whatever, and especially in the quantity that I thought normally, considering the overwhelming amount of stuff uploaded on YouTube every day, would at least make up for at least the things I do not discuss. Yes, that's the measure of evaluation. I don't hide that I'm a very ambitious person, right? I'm somehow modest in a way, but at the same time, I do have some goals overall, and it always feels like I'm making videos very, very calmly with a hand tied behind my back, because I could easily start making stuff like video reviews, criticism, etc. I did in the past. Sometimes it happened. I think I commented on 3 or 4 videos out there that particularly struck me, and or that were the opportunity to discuss something more important, because at the end of the day, if you want to criticize video, I don't make it an ideological point, right? I don't say, I'm aware of the fact that there are people who think different things, say in a political way, for example, but I'm, say, not bothered by that, because I believe that who gets things wrong goes nowhere, and so it's not even much of a threat, like instead people think of politics nowadays in general, or at least there are much greater problems of which these explicit ideological turns are just one of the least relevant aspects. So I think that with YouTube and history, there is really a lot to say. I made videos about this already. There is one, but they're old, right? So things change sometimes, also in the way I think certain things, but something like, is Schwerpunkt historically reliable? It turns out people watch, right? Probably because, as I see, it's one of the few videos that if you search for Schwerpunkt pop up, right? That's a matter of YouTube engine search or whatever. I should remake one, because I could explain better how I operate regarding that. There is surely something else in the Serene playlist regarding, yes, YouTube and historical accuracy, the strange couple. I think it was something like that. And so it's already been discussed to some extent, right? But nowadays I see things, somehow forward perspective, given that I've been here further amount of time and seen much more things, and also my content has somehow improved. So there is really room for lots of other videos of this kind, and again, the possibility, especially if you are interested, right? If you have any idea regarding what I can criticize, summarize, that would be welcome. Like, say, can you tell me, like, whether this video is good or not? If it is especially a military historical one, I could say criticize everything, preferably medieval warfare, but the problems I see on YouTube go beyond the era or my own field of specialization. They're mostly a matter of method, right? And this thing of making sources explicit is indeed one of the most important things, at least academically speaking. Say a few people know, like, my path, right? You've come across my videos, you maybe know what I do for a living, that I'm a historian, etc. But I understand that as soon as you meet with someone, you discover these channels, you say, but was the person talking, right? How does he, come up with this stuff, right? Where does he get the info? Why does he think like that? What he's referring to when he's talking about something or another? So that's yet another huge issue that we will in part treat today, at least in as much as what's the context of YouTube in the first place regarding, and the type of content that I do myself, because you understand, for example, that my channel is not confrontationally oriented, even though I'm a quite confrontational person, because, again, I prefer to just talk about the things that I evidently see. I was about to use past tense, but I realized that it's still a thing, unfortunately. Not much for the topics that may have started being covered by many channels nowadays, but that are never in function of that. In fact, that speed are often covered very superficially, and so from one side you wouldn't care because nobody ever questioned my accuracy, my correctness, etc. However, I've seen, let's say, a certain niche. I don't know even how to qualify this, because it's something more than that. It's essentially the kind of I will use the term woke here, not necessarily in the let's say political sense, but that. Evidently, I'm very far even from the colloquial terms, ideology. We can't say like that, to say the least. It's a euphemism in the first place. But the sense here is a form of paranoia, because that's what wokeism gets down to, right? It's this perennial fear, distrust, this paralyzing anxiety about anything being some sort. It's a conspiracy theory, right? It basically gets down to that, right? That when you want to be puritanic about something specific, just not making the effort of working things out, you're prone to look at a little detail that seems like imperfect or informal, or that you can make moral relativism on and say, okay, well, the whole chunk, the whole thing is trash, and basically this person is the devil, and whatever I dislike that I can't treat like this at will, or this small imperfection in even in the method, whatever. So this is not professional, so I don't trust it. Now, every opinion is of course criticizable in that regard. Here we could get to the very root of the problem, that we'll probably address in a historiographical sense. That is, how do you, like, in any sphere, are sure that what it's said is true, right? But not even said by someone else. Or here I'm not even talking about physics, books of physics, etc. Here I'm talking about what do you know what conscience is, right? Nobody has the palest idea of what the hell that is in the first place. So anything that comes into your sphere of knowledge can easily be wrong, false, imperfect, and we know better because everything we do is somehow rigged in a way. So if you want to get down to that, right, you can have fun with making your life a living hell, but at least in part it could even be profitable if you found a way to fix things, which is, in case you didn't notice, what civilization has always been trying to do. And so this kind of paranoid mentality mostly gets to the opposite result. That is to say, just stopping there and waiting to die, hating and distrusting everything around without your own personal capacity to mold it, to control it, to order it, right, to make sense of it, right? So there is always a sort of degree, like in the spectrum, like what is the level of accuracy that you're looking forward, say from a YouTube history channel, right? So the answer varies greatly, not just because of the person you may ask this to. And actually, I believe that history channels on YouTube are, as a whole, disgusting, to say the least. I mean, on average, that's the adjective that correctly qualifies, right, from my perspective, the actual thing, right? So, that I don't brag too much about my titles or whatever, but you do know that I am a PhD. The only thing I like to brag on regarding this is the institute from which I doctored myself, which probably most of you doesn't even know, but this is the proof that it doesn't matter, right? And that's why I don't even tell it, because first of all, it doesn't prove that what I say is correct or whatever. But let's say when you grow up, you start understanding, and this is a bit the point of the video, that there is a certain authority that emanates ipso facto from the degree of analysis, the criterion, the method, what you're able to display, right, as an actual capacity that, as a whole, is, if this is in part also the problem, if the other person has tools that make them, say, capable of understanding that level of complexity, and whether it's accurately, say, explained or not, realize that you can be talking about something without sources, without much of a problem. Now, I don't know if you have gone to university, if you ever attended a history class, let's say the basics exams, the ones I also make in my little, say, my small chance, to the like explaining medieval history, right, in a class lasting 3 months, right, with, I don't know, 50 people, and how to handle it, which is distressing, really. But if you like go there, those are professors in the case, like they're all doctors like me and so on. So I don't know how to tell you, but people normally, like teachers, do not stop every step of the way, if any, to actually quote any source, right? This may seem to you pretty strange. Of course, at some point there is going to be something like that, because we have studied enough sources to be able to recall some of them, but say, for example, the number of the chapter or the paragraph, that's not the case. Sometimes not even the book. Sometimes it's just, we are paraphrasing what the source said. Is it important to give the actual, explicit reference to that source to be trusted in what you're teaching, what you're talking about in the first place? Obviously not, right? This should be enough for a certain level of historical teaching that can be, say, the one, for example, that I make here, even though, that I use this term, I don't want to sound cathedratic, because, of course, in the moment in which I make a YouTube channel, I am much easier going than when I have to evaluate a student, maybe he's even older than me, and saying sometimes, no, you can't pass because you haven't learned and studied enough. Just imagine if at that point, right, during an examination, say a student that of course would be having this kind of problems only when not knowing history would say, quote me the source of what you're saying, right? Or quote me the book, the stuff, because that's also a thing, right? Scholarship, right? We'll talk about that too, because we live in this paranoid world, in which we have completely inverted the hierarchy of scientific and moral values to the degree of thinking that, for example, scholars, just per se, must have some kind of extra genius or contribution to the world, right? Just because they personally write about some source. But it is a way to distrust them in a same way. But you would be surprised to know that even though in an academic work we have to do that, that is to say, quoting every book, say every updated source that there is on the given theme that we're writing about, this has nothing to do with actually that book, that work being actually better or the best interpretation that it exists on that given topic, right? This is something I somehow, like, to me it's so normal, so evident to appreciate that and explain why that is the case, that I feel a bit like obvious even in pointing the thing out per se, right? But so it has somehow become for, say, a part of the audience that wants to smear the other, to say, okay, if you can't quote an art, that has nothing to do with the point that you are making. I must say this, that even though I'm beyond far right wing, right, to a degree that probably a National Socialist would seem like a schoolgirl in comparison to my actual ideas, that except for the fact that they're right differently from theirs. The thing, in fact, that disgusts me also in part is that, there is a sort of, say, paranoia, weakening of personal standards, and whatever are striking hard both the right and the left, right? If you are an average right-winger, an average left-winger today, you're simply a disgusting person just because of your personal background, right? That's the actual point. We're talking about elementary personal, moral, cultural basis that obviously have to do also with political inclination, but this is to say, you're not just a better person because you're part of a team or another. If you're a theist or an atheist, or if you whatever, let's say, even though there is a better and worse in these categories, the level is so dramatically low that that's the least of the problems at some point you should be concerned of, especially when you start complaining about something else, right, being not up to the standard, right? So, and you should be at least above standard to discuss these things, if you want, first of all, to make sense, but secondly also to be that respectable in the first place. So, of course, I have by now, let's say, a very long time, practically lost any interest in other people's opinions, right? I care about them only when I have a question to pose, but I do not believe absolutely that the contribution of every element is, say, necessary beyond a certain level of quality, right? I absolutely think, morally and scientifically, that we do not need that the most important thing that we can accomplish is a sense of authority, hierarchy, order, discipline, and that's what I call civilization, and not, say, a culturally underdeveloped, delirious nationalist and or socialist abortion of the dignity of mankind, because that's what tribalism gets down to being an inferior culture, right, or not having culture at all, right? I'm deeply amused when people say, but how do you explain the fact that only the left makes culture? Well, calling something culture doesn't mean that it is, right? The first problem is that we are so absorbed by our own limited, right, man-made and also lesser man-made, say better, lesser human, because that's at that point the distinction, standards that we can't even realize that they suck, right? That's an enormous problem. And the main thing that this is substantiated in is, of course, moral relativism to a degree. It's reflected also by determinism, materialism, whatever. But it gets down to something like that. Like, if I quote a book, right, I'm reliable, right? And or whatever. Now, the sheer level of complexity of certain historical topics is such that, for example, in my field of expertise, like it happens for the majority of people with my qualifications, we study things that nobody has ever studied before, at least to the point of being so advanced in the way we're personally handling the topic, right? There are certain topics that literally have never been studied, or at least that have been studied so few that it's as if they had never been. And so in that case, it would be funny to say, try to comment on and this happens during the peer reviews, which is quite fascinating, what I'm actually writing my next, my current whatever article on, right? Of course, I read peer reviewers' reviews, and the first thing I notice, because simply they haven't the palest idea of what I'm writing, because nobody has ever done it before, but they have still to show that save the face, even though they are nameless, notoriously, in that circumstance, and they will not be known. This is fascinating, by the way. The answer to be ridiculous, to be, this aspect should be deepened a bit better because of this reason, and you do not know that, I know that reason is BS, right? And I could make an article just to explain you why that is the case, right? So there are some things that I say on Schwerpunkt that pertain to that level of, if you even try, right, to address them, you should at least be me, which is somehow weird because, of course, I'm pretty sure that there is nobody at least writing about what I write, in the terms I write it, on the sources that I use, on the studies that I use, for that specific purpose. So it's quite easy, right, when you, say, the more you go on to understand not just, say, the level of historical understanding of a person, but also what's the problem behind that. Like, this is one of the single most fascinating things that, for example, YouTube offers me in the guise, for example, of reading comments of other people, right? That they're not interesting because I think I'm learning anything from what they think they're actually providing me with. But, or maybe just in the minimal part, in which they betray what these people reason like, right? It's a psychological mechanism. As I often say, I hardly ever get any criticism. But the type of criticism that I get is very often I make a 2.5 hours long video on a given topic. The person starts commenting on the few times this is a critical thing, saying wrong the very first thing I said just in the first 5 minutes, and not going ahead from that, because you understand that the person likely stopped there, or stopped literally the thing and began to write the comment from that 5-minute thing, and literally not getting, let's say, I say A is not B, and the person literally understanding A is B, right? And so we're at those levels that it's admittedly very different from what I do for a living, because most of the people that I can be even correcting in written tasks, etc., are at least writing to explain something without being, say, polemical towards anyone. Right, they're just trying to tell history, right? And so I have just to correct whether that's accurate or not. But when you get this, so it's very bizarre to get. Of course, I understand the context. It's somebody somewhere in the world, maybe even on the opposite part of it, in some room, bored in summer, high temperature, getting pissed for some reason because of the existential limits that I point out by my very statements about his life, and needing to write this thing because venting adrenaline or feeling cognitively dissonant and offended about his own person or anything like this, about things that he shouldn't be offended. Like the attitude is always the patronizing thing. I know better this thing. I'm going to explain it to you. Except you have a level of knowledge that I don't think even when I was in high school was so low. And on that very topic, by the way, so it's something shocking to me because these people are actually adults most of the times, because kids of that age nowadays do not even care about history, and at least they would be immediately recognizable. And I think that apparently it turned out to be very successful at, because people eventually answer about that is, what, albeit in the amicable interactions, what kind of age they are in the way they write, without any other evidence. And as I often say, I'm quite, perplexed from one side when I get that criticism, as rarely as can be, not much because of this. So where is the person even think to be going at that? I understand that. It's something that maybe you had as an impulse when you were, I don't know, a 19, 20-year-old, something like that. In fact, I usually nail it. But the point is also, where's the rest of the criticism? That is to say, how much of what I'm saying is actually understood correctly. I know that there are people who get it, because very rarely they do comment and they have a very specific notion of what I said that makes you understand. Not necessarily they have understood everything, but at least they have gotten it right overall. Right? That is a huge, you would think, I don't know, I see there is a silent majority, and I always hope that that's the part of the audience that actually gets it and doesn't, of course, need to say anything at that point. Somebody even told me, you said it, why should I say anything? Whatever, lots of people are not even subscribers, so they do not even have a YouTube account. So this exchange is not even needed, right? But the question is, how can, right, more broadly, in a world where this is the norm, where the level of reception is normally, at this point, can't be so much, fear, right, towards information, and specifically the one that is it's substantiated by an important degree of broader knowledge. So the aforementioned attitude, that is the one of, this guy, for example, has is conservative, and so as a leftist, you have to start from the idea that whatever he says is bullshit, and you have to immediately act contrarian towards the channel, starting saying, oh yeah, he maybe says something cool, but he has that bias, so he's not one on ours, it's BS. Other people do that also from the right. I don't know how frequently, because I think they do it much less in the first place. But also, as I was saying before, this doesn't mean you're actually much better just per se, or even when there is a sound, which I believe, of course, there is a sounder common sense from the other side. You're not necessarily able to voice it, to express yourself, to actually get the point even there. That happens too often, right? Everything is reduced to a sort of conspiracy theory, where, for example, universities are populated just by radical leftist professors. If you've studied history, you've surely been influenced by that. I'm, for example, the proof that is not the case, not just because there wasn't much of that in the place where I studied, but simply because there we do something else, right? This is what also makes me see this attitude as a bit of witch hunt. The fact that if you do not you not make explicit your sources, you're somehow hiding some strange secret or mystery, or you're just working behind the scenes to be more, let's say, to partisanly push for a direction or another. I think that this attitude is due to the fact that, of course, the swamp in which this I use YouTube as a point of reference here in terms of historical average in the first place is that the level is so low, and it started to be at some point admittedly and openly biased on purpose to attract people from that side of the aisle or another, that legitimately, especially the younger people, come up with the idea, but how the hell do we know, like, given that we do not know anything about anymore, literally we do not even know that history existed as such, and if we ever wanted to learn something of it, how do we essentially sort out the information? Who can we follow, right? So I realize how difficult it is to talk about this, because first of all, you should always point out that following someone as such is not really a good idea. It means you have given up the initiative to whichever antagonistic force could even help you growing up, right? Rather than making the work yourself, so that at some point it's better to be polemical than being passive, right, to somebody's information. But the point is also, how and why would you expose yourself just for... I understand people make money for being biased towards a political opinion or another. I think this is generally speaking evident, right? I track because I'm planning something, right, for the criticism of certain content and so on, but pick all the channels making medieval history content of some kind, right? Let's cross out the documentary style ones, even the ones lasting, 15 minutes with animations, etc., because those are probably the worst, because they may even be well informed, but not necessarily being able to deliver the actual information in a way that the person, first of all, understands that, or in a way that actually is understood by people who are competent in it, right? This is a very interesting thing, and say you may have also the correct information, but not being able to explain the actual reasons why that is the case. And so either you just paraphrase the text where you're getting this information from, or you're telling it in a way that you try to, let's say, adapt so that you think maybe it's even easier for a broader audience to understand. And everybody says, oh my god, this is just a great channel, like millions of subscribers, etc. And when you actually just listen to what they say, they're terribly superficial things. I don't know how people actually are able to watch that stuff, right? It's painful, right? So not to say, again, that it must be necessarily wrong, but it's so basic that the question is, say, you could easily learn through Wikipedia better. Why do you need a freaking 10 minutes video that you will forget about, by the way, because you didn't make any effort to stay there understanding what it really meant, or the broader historical implications that would make you aware, just even of in perspective of the quantities, of the qualities involved, of what actually happened in a more concrete sense, that in 10 minutes you can't even begin to discuss and frame and think and fix as a consequence correctly. I'm talking about those channels that are mostly like me, based on a single guy talking about this or that. And they're all, of course, partisan. I'm partisan too, to a degree, right? I make videos trying to explain something very specific about normally what you never hear around, right? This is not to say I never hear, it's just, alt-right propaganda. Well, okay, you can hear it everywhere, actually, or leftist propaganda. They always use that rhetoric, right? This thing nobody talks about, or they didn't tell you, or they hide us, or this kind of BS, right? Or people usually do not understand, but maybe it's yourself who doesn't understand that to a degree. Like, before saying something like this, and I use a lot of derogatory terms towards this kind of generic, human that I prototype, but it's really a thing in function of my experience. And since I talk exactly in first person, and I go really in depth with certain of these topics, like I don't feel challenged by anyone, right? There will be a day in which people will criticize me, because if the channel keeps on growing, even though slowly, surely my videos will be targeted at some point by criticism. I can't wait for that, because that means actually more subscriptions, more views, whatever. So that would be very fun. So just enjoy the ride, as long as so peacefully and apathetically, stoically, untouched by any external perturbation. But the point being is that they start. I noticed this is pretty evident. I can't tell you because you refine your understanding over time. Whether this was the case 5 years ago when I started, or things got a bit, rougher along the way, right? I think that especially COVID made the mess. Like, we all became much more ideological with both sides of the aisle to a degree that is just hysterical. And the point is, these figures are going out there normally by making videos that want to talk about the odd issues, and that admittedly do get subscribers because these behave like a herd, saying, "Oh, this is the one that says kind of the thing I say. I will subscribe and say, oh, how cool you are! You're my next hero." But in those very videos, there is no actual in-depth criticism of that. There is just a bunch of punchlines of alleged gotcha points, and sometimes this kind of quoting sources or books, as if, again, they're not very longer than the documentaries, it may be 10 minutes, 20 minutes. There is not the time to address what you would like to at that point. Just if you make a relentless work of, say, systemic analysis, video after video after video after video, referencing to all the stuff all together, you could make a credible, serious point, right? Just becoming the meme that says that is BS because, they're radical fanatics and we are better. You're not actually helping anyone. Mildly so, the imbecile who actually believes that radical stuff, but to a degree that is not necessarily fixing the core issue that you yourself hasn't an idea of. Right, there are some, but I would like to stress how low these things go, right? I've seen, I don't want to make names, but I've seen recently, there was a video that was complaining about, this was a video based on Roman history and also issues with the Christianization of the empire, that literally stated that, and specializing exclusively on that. I don't know how many videos were made and so on, but saying something that Christianity ended the separation of church and state in the Roman Empire. Now, if you are, this is not about being a traditionalist, also in a pagan sense or whatever. This is literally like failing completely in any political, juridical, religious notion of both the Roman Empire in the pagan phase and in Christian times. Everybody knows that in Roman times, the actual point was crushed by the Christians was the fact that, say, religion and state were the same thing, right? Because the emperor was meant to be like that, also as the first priest of the empire and things like that. And that Christianity, even though, and this is a problem also of how we have interpreted modernity, was actually the one who said, no, the church is something completely separated from the state, right? And at best, they can't go in parallel if they are allied, and so we are wrongly assuming that in the contemporary era there was a separation of church and state as if before they were united as two separated institutions. Admittedly, something like that happened for the Protestants, for which the kings became the heads of the church, so Catholicism was something completely different. And no, you can't make a comparison between paganism and Protestantism because they are also two completely and diametrically opposite things in the very essence of just look at what the works and grace work like. Protestantism, but the mere thing of comparing even, and I don't want to say what that video was explicitly comparing because otherwise you would understand which video that is and the like how forced that is, right? We are on the same side of the political aisle as a direction, right? But this is a pile of garbage, right? If a person went there to a university of lay people, as my background of right wing, of left wing, but actually competent scholars who go to say such a thing to them, you would be laughed at publicly, because it means that you failed completely the basics of the very, say, cultures, countries, religious ideas, whatever you're supposed to be discussing. But the ugly thing of this is that you have crowds flocking there because they're told this BS. Of course, I must admit, in some of the comments under that video, there was somebody actually saying, in say a bit more polite terms, what I'm saying, especially about the separation of religion and state, and of course to be as a ridiculous statement in the first place. But that's when you realize that in order to ridiculize a person in that regard, is that necessary to actually quote a book or a source in order to do it? Well, of course, if you are so, let's say, cultured to know about one of such references, you could fit in there. But the point is that a concept like that, right, cannot be explained in, say, if the other person is, like in this case, completely at the obscure of the situation, of the notion, etc. The thing there that you have to fight against is not the ignorance. Like, even if you provide that person with an actual phrase that tells you differently, or you find, and you have to find it in a book, which books, right, for example, will at some point have that phrase, the same thing that I'm saying, and that, however, nobody notices, because at some point it's obvious if you have studied anything about those topics from the basics. And why would we bother ourselves with, say, like I'm not doing right now, in fact, to criticize the thing, to actually find that quote, as there could be 300 or 500, but I don't know, in 10,000 books, or maybe less, but still, that's, like, even if there were in 1 out of 3, like, how long should I be searching for something that's so, say, just obvious for anyone who's in that field? It is actually useless, because you have to fight, first of all, against the prejudice, the ego, the say, whatever reaction this person can be, even in the moment in which they were somehow peaceful about that, which usually is inversely proportional to the degree of ignorance, right? So the question there is, if you have the complete lack of self-respect to put yourself out there by saying things that you obviously do not know anything about, how are you going to react to someone pointing that out heavily, right? That's something that, for example, I don't care about. I mean, if it happened to me, if I made a mistake, and I would say, well, yeah, this is a mistake, but before you have to battle on a ground that goes far beyond a single quote. And that takes time. And in fact, I was just reflecting about one video that I was looking at about another guy that this is the thing that made me think about this whole video today from some time, that was criticizing I think, I don't know, that this is yet, and these are relatively famous, especially the one criticized is a relatively famous YouTuber of those who makes kind of what-ifs. And they are based on a very specific ideological, deterministic, cyclical idea of how politics and world works, and, saying a pile of garbage that, of course, doesn't end at any point, because any analyst, politically, strategically, economic, whatever, would simply tell you this thing is not possible, right? And you're just basically oversimplifying, because that's what dumb people want you to do, oversimplify things, because they not just there is the thing of, say, it's too complex, it's too afford, but there is also this other stage where most of the people that, in my opinion, come when they ask for quotes, that is the one in which you get in the actual complexity at some point, but you still do not understand anything about that. I'm from a position that makes sense of complexity, That doesn't say, oh my god, here there is such a, we do not know, further research has to be done. Now I will quote the last updated scholar, so this is my point of reference. No, when you actually know something significantly, systematic about history, answers come immediately. Just you are able to read through the thing, right? There are some generalizations that I make about medieval history, for example, that I make exclusively because I got to the point, after having seen the thing over and over and over and over and over again, that even though they're very simple and very fact-based and somehow macroscopic and self-evident, a person may not even have ever pictured to that level of, to that scale of complexity to be agreeing with me. It would sound fishy, it would sound, but it's too simple in that regard. Right? This has nothing to do with any, again, deterministic scenario. This is describing what actually happened, which is what I am interested in the first place as a historian, and just as the person curious in these topics that became a historian for sorting them out. Right? So that's why I do the thing. Right? And this what-if stuff was criticized because the guy who made this content actually posted what were the more influential works that he followed, and again, they were deterministic BS, etc. And so this smaller channel began to criticize it, and simply made all a. I should premise this, that the what if guy was I don't know. I think he was a political extremist of some kind. At some point, I think it was a leftist extremist, like, I don't know, a communist nostalgic or something. I don't think he was a right-winger, etc. But the guy who criticized him was at least an historical materialist. Like, so, and even it could easily be a socialist. I don't say where he came from, but he was pretty open about that. He follows all the BS, like the full kind of leftist narrative of, like, especially from an American background in a very Americanized country in Europe. And the point was, and this guy is actually a historian, and insisting very much on the method. That is to say, if I don't quote the source where this stuff is, proven wrong, I cannot actually win, or at least I can argument the thing, but I do not have enough authority as when I actually find the disproval of this thing. Now, this is true. In as much as we're talking about episodic things, like, knowing a date, a place, a battle, whatever happened, etc. And don't be so, let's say, just don't think that is so easy even at that level. But when things get more complex, right, the notion that just by quoting one book, or two, or three even, is enough, right, to give an overall interpretation to history is, first of all, the death of history itself. Because it means that you basically would just operate on the basis of this works, and in order to add something to it, you would have just to be perfectly specialized in that field, which is not necessarily true, because you could get, and when I say field, I mean something very confined in time and space, so the ones for which you become provided with an actual expertise, you could easily have seen the thing is not the case from your own field of expertise, which tells you something else, which is often the case because we are facing a time in history where hyper-specialization is making scholarship extremely blind to basically any other notion, even just in, I made lots of these examples, like medievalists who, I don't know, were special. Once I asked for a bibliographical advice to somebody who studied, I think, a city in the mid-14th century, and this person answered me, but you should know that I specialize in the history of the second half of the 14th century, and you're asking for something from the first half of the 14th century. I think I didn't answer him because I would have probably sent him to hell, but that's the level to which we somehow arrived, and while and scholarship does abuse of this. Scholarship very often proceeds like that. That is to say, if you're not, let's say, if you do not have the chevron to to say, well, are you qualified, or talk about it. You can be dismissed in some way, or at least you can be looked upon with suspicion, because this is not something that is done on simply this formal level, but just a person who is younger, for example, or somebody who has a specific idea that maybe is actually correct, but maybe the professor has never heard of, and so automatically says, but wait, I have to think this out, or this is not what I think it is the case, so this person must be wrong, without even having myself the actual evidence, remember what I said at the beginning, you don't remember everything by heart. That's not what we do as historians. That's ridiculous to even think in the first place. And in fact, that same guy who criticized the what if-er, let's say, when he had to quote, like with the suggestions for a certain topic, said, well, there are so many books that I can't tell you just, I don't know, the ones that I don't remember what we said in that regard, but that I either prefer or I think that are better for some reason that I don't even explain. So that doesn't count as a historical arbitrary notion. I actually respect that. I think that if you want to make the case that, I don't know, those books for you are best, but you don't want to necessarily explain at the moment why, it's still, okay, I'll take it from a YouTuber. But at that point, don't you think that the level of complexity that you're trying to criticize, maybe not in the case of that guy, but still at that point be criticizable, especially if you are an explicit materialist, socialist, or whatever, just biased per se, so that I will not trust you because I think that you still have a deterministic, relativistic mentality of the kid freshly come out of a bachelor or a master degree, and that thinks that he's a historian because he just quotes stuff. I think it's ridiculous, right? And it cannot be seen as an example of reliability. And so, in our authority, right? I have been, let's say, when I was at university, it was pretty much irregimented within the modus operandi of the university. That is brutal, is somehow they do not care. But you admittedly still have to learn, right? So you go through the ranks, let's say, and you actually make some experience. But everything that and in that sense, I must say, the professors weren't even insisting so much on this, which seemed to me odd at a point, especially when I had to write something myself, like the various theses and so on, because I realized that of all the things that we read, and surely, again, it's a very good place where to study, and we met people from, I don't know, exchange students from the Sorbonne, people said, but do you actually study all this stuff? Like, they had no clue, because apparently it's a thing that doesn't happen abroad. But in all of that, like basic things of how to quote, like how to write a bibliography, all of this stuff, were okay, well, that you will learn how to do it. That's the minimal thing, right? First, you have to learn a shitload of stuff, and then you can be called a historian, because that is a bit of a seminal part of your cerebral age. And so the more you read, the more you learn, the better a historian will become. It will make you, as professors, reading the best stuff, and you will learn history just per se, right? And you could understand even from those books which ones were better, worse. As you know, I'm very critical in general of everything, right? And still at the time, I could immediately, for example, smell any kind of, I don't know, leftistic or liberalistic idea. That there was some of that, right? As much as there was some that somewhere else, but at least the proportion is different. In any case, the point being that I learned military history in parallel to university from a guy who was, I think he had been a professor of, however, say, in another field. Now I will not explain what the thing was also, however, an excellent military enthusiast, and that taught me the actual method, dialectically, in just even, the person who brought us to study von Clausewitz that heavily, because that's a hell of an example of method for military history that poses, by the way, some much more specific and concrete problems historically than, say, social history in a broader sense, right? And don't think that here the branches of history that you study do not have an influence. I am the one I am because I'm a military historian, right? I don't even call myself a medievalist. For me, military history is more important than the Middle Ages as such, even though on paper I am a medievalist, because simply I studied, first of all, much more military history and do much more military history, and I can see beautifully what are the limits of an average medievalist, because he has not studied, for example, military history the way I did. And there are people who also study military history differently and that I disagree with, etc. But I can explain, as you can observe in my never-ending videos, every step of the way when I want, if I'm asked, etc. Simply because I have earned that confidence in the things that I explain, right? To me, if you find yourself in that process in which you do not know, right? There is an issue that you say, I have no idea what this thing happens. You may be dangerously unaware of lots of other things. Say, not even having orientatively an idea of why things happen, right? This is beyond. This is a real question of method. This is beyond even the actual information, right? And even the actually correct information. You may have a first impression based on something that, if you are obviously less knowledgeable in that field, may of course turn out to be too much, like in the sense that you really had a completely different picture of the world. But this is also, for example, why I make these videos about, the regional series covering all of Europe, because if you do not do that, and if you think I'm doing that just to flatter you for wherever you come from, you're deeply mistaken. Like, the entire point of these videos is to give the correct dimension, quantitatively and qualitatively, to these various things, because I compare them diachronically, which is actually what history gets down to, right? And so if you have not passed through there, which is usually what the person that is still waiting for, like, to find a page or a quote to make a good impression, or to like make the showing that he's so knowledgeable and whatever, to remember that precise detail, usually hasn't done. So knowing basically 1,000 more stuff that maybe you do not, of course, individually remember at all, but that having gotten through them and having sorted out has shaped your mind to interpret things in a way that becomes authoritative, because you've gone through that path, right? This is the thing that I think is the most fascinating about history, is that you cannot teach history concretely to people thinking that they will passively receive this historical wisdom and that they will actually understand what you're saying. Because until they haven't made their own research, they will not understand that. So at that point, maybe you may be the one who says, but I read that book and that guy said that thing and that's the only thing I know, right? So explain me why that is not the case. That is a point, that is fair, right? But you will understand in that, for example, I would never answer you by simply quoting a source or another book. I don't follow scholars. I really don't. I think it's the lamest thing you can really do. Unless, you can, of course, have favorite names, you can have favorite works and all this stuff, and remembering them, with passion, with interest, with great, say, admiration, etc. But the way you have to answer what happened in history at a given point cannot be answered simply through, well, there's that guy who thinks that it's of that reason. Do you say, what's the purpose of remembering that guy unless it's, I can't think historically a valid reason, right? Unless you're talking properly about a primary source, meaning, Herodotus said, well, that's another thing, right? But if you're saying about, 20th century author, this guy thought this. Who the fuck cares about this guy? Even if he had been the best historian of his time, right? People will want historical explanation, want to hear why things went the way they did at the time, and you have to be able to provide a satisfactory answer that is cogent, coherent, that really explains it, that is not just a turnaround without stepping into it, because they fundamentally do not know about that, right? And there are some just ways of teaching that are wrong, aside from certain ways of learning, right? This idea, for example, that you have to break the schemes, the misconceptions, because it's all different, everything better. That's called moral relativism, right? If somebody has come up with an idea and you want to criticize it, it simply will go by it. You will have to explain it without saying, okay, I'm a historical materialist, for example, so everything that goes against that dogma is wrong in my opinion, but I don't know why in the subject matter, because objectively I don't know anything about the topic, and any person who does obviously realizes that social materialism is bullshit. It has nothing to do with that. And that the weird thing about it, by the way, is that it also reveals that there is an actual merit of quality in anti-leftist positions in the first place. Anti-relativism, anti-determinism, anti-materialism. So what tradition obviously has always and exclusively been about is that there is actually no content in those positions. It's not an actual analysis of what happened, what really occurred quantitatively, to the point that you are able to appreciate, say, why a person expressed that idea of how things went, or how, let's say, unpredictable they were at the time, and what a political decision is. That's an easy, cheap shortcut normally younger people use, because they want more certainties, and they tend to sediment them like that at the moment, and then eventually they turn more conservative, say, idealist in a way. But the interesting thing is that even when you find out how archetypes work, and you see it from my channel, for example, I don't make idealistic propaganda. I don't consider myself an idealist. I just explain how history works for what I have seen and appreciated, also in a quantitative sense, in a way that takes into account really lots of variables, and try to observe that is the case. Let's say, tracing the cause-effect relation. That, of course, is something that starts making sense only when you appreciate the complexity of the system and how the thing could have gone otherwise. So the complete and direct opposite of an ideological position or dogmatic position, because it just doesn't care about it in the first place. If you just enter into history just thinking to sort out the thing from whichever side of the aisle you come, you know perfectly well that the only reason why you're doing that is that you want to piss somebody off, and that you still haven't sorted out things about yourself, because otherwise you would already have the answers. So you would simply answer things as they should be answered, with facts and logic that you can even source and quote and as much as you like, but that will make sense only when you will be able to use those sources and putting them together. That is not simply quoting them or saying, oh, look, I found in this book something that says something against this other notion, so I will use it to source back my opinion. In part, that's how, of course, learning history works. But again, there is nothing worse than, say, following somebody else, saying, why is that thing like that? I don't know, but that guy said it. So basically, I'm covered for it. This is valid for every single person. Like, if you give up your own personal initiative as a person, as a moral and cultured individual, you will not be any of the above. You will not be these things. And that's why I have utter contempt towards, literally at this point, what I see, if I open the internet or watch TV, as I very rarely do, or went out, looking at people on the street and saw something positive, I would say, well, good, I'm glad, and I hope that there is. But if this is not the case, how can you not be contemptuous towards it? How can't you actually dismiss people? And that's also where authority lays. That is to say, it's like with comments. I never waste time answering criticism when I see that criticism is devoid of foundation, and I do not have to provide anyone in that sense with the evidence of it. My credibility is not going to be belittled by that. On the contrary, that's exactly that none said, right? That not said that is more powerful than all the bullshit that you can say about a given topic without actually knowing anything about them, and so that even by knowing the actual things, it doesn't take anything to explain them without having to expose what kind of sources you use or what kind of sources in general, right, you use to substantiate that claim. Things must first of all make sense on their own, right? Then there are other considerations one could make again about the nature of the channel. My channel, as I said, is not confrontational so far. It's not based on some kind of polemical competition, critical competition with somebody else, if not in this kind of general sense. I absolutely believe that most of what is uploaded on YouTube as history is useless, right? This also makes a lot of damage to the actually good content, because if YouTube became a actually good place, right, in terms of, for example, historical information, I think the whole platform would benefit from it, the audience would benefit from it, and everything would be, say, particularly useful, right? If there would be a kind of greater standard, people wouldn't even have to complain about such issues, right? This is the magic world where we would like to be, and at that point, maybe, if standards went up, I wouldn't even be one of the best channels anymore. There are lots of implications in all this. You have to see that everybody has limits, so standards are always just a matter of the good enough or the average that works. But when the average starts doing something else as opposed to even whatever the issue is, right? So making some sort of activism without evidently caring about history. That's the thing. Imagine if and the thing about that, this is what I wanted to say as always, that remember that socialist that criticized that what-ifists. He was right about criticizing that BS, right? He had all my support for that, not because he was a socialist, not because he was whatever, I don't care. The terrifying thing was reading in the comments. The comments are always telling you anything about this stuff. They were all, haha, look at all these. Actually, now I remember, thanks to this, that I think the what if guy was possibly, no, wait, that was another video, and I will talk about this too, perhaps at some point, because this guy, and that's why I dislike Torley, for example, made another video about criticizing the Crusades, right? Now, the average idiot that thinks that I make videos just for, again, right-wing without even understanding what right-wing actually is, because I actually do it, right? But the problem is that there are people who believe to be right-wing or conservative without even understanding what that actually means, especially in the light of tradition. Think that if I were to laugh now about somebody that said shit about the Crusades, I would just be going with something like, I don't know, they were right because the Muslims were attacking the Christians from a much longer time than the First Crusade, right? That's basically the most obvious point I would be making, in part. The reason why the Crusades were something that have nothing to do with being criticized in the light of modern, say, liberal issues, comparing the Crusades to colonialism, all this garbage, etc., is that they don't even get what the let's say, why the crusade was what it was. Like, none of them concentrates not on the casus belli and or again, but what is that the crusade was different like as any other war of religion that was normally waged since the dawn of civilization. Then you understand that the historical materialism of the socialist kid who is come out of this kind of, in fact, that's a leftistic dominated environment, evidently, from the historian who quotes from books and from sources, etc., that they don't give a shit about the qualitative, vertical knowledge of history, knowing the actual thing. They use history just to blame somebody else for something that eventually gets down to their own personal shortcoming, right? Because this is not about having a take on history. This is about having a take on what you think history is that you do not have the palest idea of, which is a completely different thing. That's why I said before that you cannot flatter yourself being an average conservative today, because average conservatives are some of the most radically and culturally underdeveloped people you can ever imagine, just as the liberals are. Or now, just because they are average people in this given time in history for very, very specific reasons. And this is a tragedy of unspeakable proportions, and nobody cares. Right, so that it will not be quoting what book or another if you're not even able to evaluate the quality of that book or another. Right, when you explain a major topic like, say, the same Crusades, what you really want to know, like, is why. Again, what we were saying before, if you do not have the idea why they happened, and the only thing you see is, okay, the Pope sends an army to recover the Holy Land and killing the infidels in the process, and that's the only thing you know, but you still don't know why it happened, right? Or at least you have some simplistic third-grader ideas, such as, it was about money, man, yeah, because it's all about money, right? It's the church, like that tells you alone that you have not done your homework, that even if you read a book about the Crusades, you still wouldn't understand what this thing was, in part because the most updated books on the Crusades, or even, it doesn't matter that before, it was better, that were better done, but do not explain that themselves. Do not provide you with depth of contextual, for example, religious, cultural, political background to condensate this into at least attempting to find a specific explanation about what this really was, right? While it is true that you cannot simply answer the question, why were the Crusades fought for? Like, this is something that, I don't know, 5 years ago, for example, I would have answered in a more composite way. Like, there were this and that factors, and they were somehow blended in one. Today, I would answer in a completely different way, and I would just work on identifying the distinguishing factor of what this really was, comparing it to lots of other, wars, and they all were war of religions. The Crusades didn't invent anything in this regard, and this is the most interesting thing, because that's where most of the of the ignorant criticism that comes from. It was a war of religion. It was terrible for that reason. So basically, you're telling me, as a military historian specialized in the Middle Ages, that you basically ignored the single most universal notion about warfare in the history of mankind. So what should I think about you? How should I treat you? Right? Why should I feel contempt for you, for the fact that your parents have not been able to provide you with an adequate education? And why should I discount any of this? Why should I think that the world is fine by living among people like you? This is the actual problem. And this is the problem nobody addresses. That's why I'm not a socialist, God forbids, right? And I think that that's, again, an abortion of the dignity of mankind in the first place, but for very specific reasons that are exemplified just by this level of ignorance alone. And, of course, an enormous load of other things, many more important things. But this is the point. When you quote a book, you do not actually show that you understand that book. right? Because you could quote another book that talks about that book, and so you make this weird game of trying to be a professional reviewer for a living. That's again not how you acquire historical knowledge. The only historical knowledge that you acquire is making a research from the sources for reconstructing a given dimension. That has to be also a thing, right? I did this in 4 years, every day, studying, every single military event documentable in an area like a regional scale lasting for 60 years, and having to make sense of this. How many people do this or did this? Even historians, people who have a master degree, and do you think that that's enough? Do you think that if you do that, or even if you have a PhD, I've known colleagues that objectively were writing BS, and so the reason why I can afford to say this, and I don't feel any disturbance in using these terms in front of you, is that all I've done on Schwerpunkt for you to know me, for my historical, capacity, speaks for itself. Like, the level of authority that I reached, for better or for worse, is the one that I exemplify. You will never find on YouTube nowadays an explanation like this. I don't know that. Right? I can assure you, if you make a filter, say, every day, what kind of videos about medieval, containing the word medieval, Middle Ages are posted, nobody will tell you this. Nobody will even start conceiving to make a video like this. There are people who do this for a living in some other environments. There are some historiographical currents talking about methodology, and say it's a bit borderline history of philosophy or stuff like that. I mean, it doesn't, win my sympathy particularly, because most of that is actually morally relativistic. Because again, if you do not do this job that I explained to you, you can't even start doing this one, right? At best, I could do it because I passed through these problems, and I think I have enough evidence of what I'm talking about regarding, for example, you would be surprised by how much I harvested, by the way, involuntarily, or at least without an initial awareness that this would have happened, from YouTube itself, from the comments of people, as I said before, from the mindset of people, from the psychology of people. Books are understood only on that base, because aside from what they say, there is a way in which they say it, which is the thing that matters the most. You could even be perfect in the way you explain a certain book, but still being terribly boring and useless, as it happens, because these things have either been told by somebody else, or because they're said in such a, patchy fashion that do not really turn out useful for anyone, that there are much better books from which you can access the information. And the reason why it can be such a disaster is that you probably haven't researched this thoroughly. You do not know the topic yourself well. So what we trust in historical capacity is not, the presence of an information or another, but the quality of the information that is contained. That for a person who has passed through the difficulty, right, and the intellectual development that it requires to get to such awareness, to write such a thing, can only be understood. So you'd say, well, basically there is a boundary between the layman, the commoner, and somebody with at least an advanced historical understanding. Of course there is, but the point is that this barrier is created by the commoner. It's not made of, simply the addition of just a large amount of information per se. But it's not just substance, it's form, right? And if you reason in a messed up way, because you never had to sort out a more complex system than, I don't know, like a high school essay, well, it's highly unlikely that you're going to see clearly, or to evaluate correctly, or to have any substantial knowledge or awareness about what happens politically, militarily, socially around you, or even to understand this difference in history. I'm not making it a matter of simply of education, just per se. It is mostly about education, I will not lie, but I don't want to give the impression that it's just education. it's not, again, a passive mechanism. It's about how much you do. There are people who pass through the same identical educational paths, but that do, I don't know, maybe 10 times more than the others. And maybe they do not even do so better than the others at some level. So it's all about how you refine this over time, and which kind of application you find to it, and if you're able to adjust such skills to framing different other systems that you come along the way, right? And the coolest thing is that once you have done it, like, you are aware of that level of complexity also for the other systems. So it's not a sum of knowledge, but a sort of an exponential awareness that the skills provides you. So when, say, somebody like that socialist guy is trying to sell me books, saying, this is the best so far, like, I obviously know that you're selling me a book that is telling me something just in a way that in 21st century historiography is inclined towards a certain view, to debunk certain ideas because of that specific target. That's what it means to be an expert. Not knowing that in the book there is something written about that, because just by knowing just the title, or sometimes the title is enough, right? Sometimes in the title you can commit such gross theoretical misconceptions that you can easily say this person doesn't understand shit about anything, right? If you confuse war with conflict, for example, it just means you do not have a strategic education. There is nothing around that. You can be studying for years and years and years, but until you don't understand that difference, you will tell me that all that information will be, you understand what, right? So the best thing in this sense a historian can do is not, again, going backwards, pinpointing a phrase or a notion or whatever, but showing by sheer, again, authority, the capacity of wielding such a huge amount of knowledge by explaining it in a comprehensive way that makes sense and that is able to be adapted to any circumstance, right? And this extends to any field at that point. And this is the true thing that matters, right? That hyper-specialization doesn't pay, right? If you do not add on it some substantial type of knowledge matured in that comparative way, you will never make it. You will never go beyond that somehow immature mindset that is just shared, I think, by most adults in an evident fashion. And the terrible thing, again, in those videos were the comments, right? And that's one of the crusades. Conservative historians are a completely different type. They're ridiculous, whatever. And everybody patting on each other's back, believing this BS, because of course there are a bunch of disgusting socialists or worse who are not writing that because they have any clue about what that guy is saying, but because they think that there is a form in simply saying, oh, look, I quote books for making this video. And just telling you at some point, however, there are too many books, so I will just tell you a bunch so that's what matters for us, right? So a person who has evident problems, like, the average commentator, etc., that feels a failure because he's not been able to be enough, has not worked enough, has been complaining, whining, to be a social parasite and to be maintained by somebody else, and so on, and has faith exclusively for that reason, because there is not another reason, right? Everybody goes through an attrition, and the one that you can experience in today's world can be hard in some way, but it's absolutely surpassable by most standards if you were just up to, if you didn't spend yourself such generalization, probably that would be an indicator that you would be already a more successful individual, right? But this sense that a sort of communities formed around the leader that, however, doesn't actually explain, doesn't actually speak, doesn't actually tells you, look, I quoted this stuff, but I don't even tell you why on the bigger picture things are massively more complicated than imagined, why I simply discarded this theory. Because, look, I can quote 5 people that think it like me, even though there are, of course, many more of the competent ones, of course, that are disagreeing at the same time and not entering the merit of it as well. Seems to be the favorite sport, like, of some, this manualistic, puppet that wants to tell you that you resolve everything with that. I knew a professor, by the way, who was like that. A person who didn't, go to the toilet if it wasn't prescribed by, a note by some author in some book, right? Every single thing is true exclusively if you can quote it. Now, again, if you write an article, it's a completely different story. You should know that. And then the beauty of it is when you know the entire story, you can simply spit on the people who didn't know shit, because there is plenty of in the scholarship, and saying it out loud, which is what I'm actually doing with my articles, by the way. And I hope to really start being a pain in the behind for at least a good half of the historiography on medieval warfare as a consequence, simply because I know what I'm saying. And I remember this Moran was just like, as usual, say, he wasn't even antipathetic himself. Like, I apostrophate him like this because I evaluate the military historian, not even the person per se. But the sense was, this was a professor of naval history, I think, and he had decided, even without any specific competence, that he would step into military history. Because most military historians that you read of, they are not actual military historians. They have not concentrated their entire curriculum, and very often their own properly university education on warfare. They just incidentally come across it, and then they maybe like the topic, etc., and they get into it, but they do not have any specific education. Some have. Some don't, right? Some acquired it in just because of intelligence. The interesting thing is that usually more intelligent people, and so the ones that also don't have this spasmodic sense of needing to quote every single thing as they move, even in a regular conversation, are also the ones who are able to parody of progress, let's say, military education, to say more intelligent things, because war is also reality in the first place, like any other. It requires more intelligence to be understood in the first place. And this guy came out after having this guy publish stuff, etc. And this was a group which we knew each other, etc. This person stated the following: that he didn't understand tactics because he always found strategy easier to understand. Well, this is the point. Do you realize, this is a rhetorical question, do you realize why this statement is wrong? You see, notoriously, for people with strategic education, that I do not need to provide you sources for, because I can afford not to. This is the beauty of it. Right? Strategy is notoriously and scale dramatically more complex than tactics. If you go out there as a scholar, as a military historian, saying, I don't understand tactics, I've always found strategy easier to understand, the reality is that you do not understand shit about either of the two. Like, you're stating it out loud, right? If a person doesn't know the difference, in this sense, between strategy and tactics, as he didn't, by the way, and he was reading him, obviously this statement would be, so well, it's possible then strategy and tactics to be in this relation of, let's say, of difficulty of understanding, say complexity or whatever, right? The other, if you do not know the answer to that, it simply means that you haven't gone through a path that, incidentally, I went. I'm sure there are so many other paths that you went through that I didn't go through. So it's really relatable for anyone. This is not about acting arrogant. This is about being honest about the thing. If I don't want to explain you at all, if I didn't if I hadn't actually already do it in my videos about military theory and the Krieg and so on, that of course people do not like to watch because, the pictures of the soldiers are funnier, I guess, and so making their brains work is a completely different story. I don't have to tell you. I will just keep it for me, just as my sources, just as my books, anything, right? And you will have to go by that. I'm not punishing you here. Here I'm talking to an imaginary person who would say you would have to provide with sources for everything you say on the internet to be reliable on it. No. Just like I don't do it at university. I do it only when I write articles. I must say this, when I'm in a conference and you have to speak for 20 minutes about your article, of course you cannot you cannot stick to but a very few quotes that of course you will not even stop telling the page, the chapter, the paragraph of necessarily, depending on the hierarchy of importance given the speech you're giving. And nobody will even ever ask you that, right? Even if they could, for which I have the entire article written already with the actual quotes and everything, so I could easily provide you that with. But the historian doesn't do this. The historian elevates himself on the base of his valor, like anyone, in the virtue of what makes sense, what it doesn't. If you write poorly your article, your speech, and people do not understand, they will make you question. And they will say, I didn't understand this point, can you explain it? And then you will have to explain it, etc. But if you make the actual point, and you, of course, do not provide with all the sources that you used to, and all the references that you used for writing the article, you're making somebody listening that usually, at least the most noticeable participants already know the plausibility of, and that would never, for this reason, as experts, ask you the reference because they trust you, because they can evaluate the quality of what you're saying, and could easily ask you what were the sources, but exactly because they recognize the quality of the work will not. And so it should be working on YouTube as well. So that sources are, by the way, you know that I use sources, right? I often say, well, there's this author says this, that. I often don't even say which edition. Like, imagine for every, I don't know, if I quote Wallhausen or, I don't know, Machiavelli or whatever, I were to say, well, it's in this book, in this paragraph, and then I will tell you which edition come out in which year, by which scholar. It would be ridiculous. First of all, nobody would listen. But secondly, it's useless. Because what matters is not that quote per se, but what I'm able to draw from it, which is a completely different thing that I could never provide you with the sources of. And the beauty of this, and why this is so right-wing, is that this correction is based on the hierarchy of value. Somebody who has to ask you for everything each step of the way is a child who doesn't know what you're talking about, right? History, the world, mankind is based on hierarchy. Civilization, culture, intelligence, the dignity of the superiority of command is based on hierarchy, right? And if you're not able to recognize that, you are below, you're under, right? And you will stay there until you rise to the top, right? So this is how we work, right? This is how a respectable historian works, not as somebody who has to answer, right, of expressing a historical opinion on YouTube, right? You're not my peer reviewer, right? You're not looking at my article. If I were to make, as I probably will, videos out of my articles, I will not quote you the sources. It would be idiotic. There are like 30 pages. Most of that are notes, and I will paste and copy of the notes and try to fit them in broader text for the video. I will tell you this chronicle says, and do you think that I'm just telling you in the video at which page of which edition of this chronicle, etc. This is so that you can go read it, unless I would say it out loud. Sometimes I do quote entire passages, and again, you can find it easily on your own. You don't have to indicate to every single thing at every step of the way. This is how you should react, right, to somebody asking you for resources in that regard, unless, of course, what you're saying is complete BS, right? But as exemplified before, as that guy who thought literally that, in the Roman Empire, religion and state were separated. You don't need either, to quote anything to ridiculize this person, because who simply knows that the people who need to know that really already do, right? And so that's why YouTube is a completely different thing. I'm sorry to say this, but it's obvious. YouTube is just a general audience, right? There are people who are more interested than the average in certain topics, whatever. But I must say that the day in which I meet a person that is at my own, I don't want to say my own level, but at least that I can have a conversation about the same things I work on, for example, for a living, I never met. Right? It would be me telling them what this is about and answering questions, of which I would be glad. I mean, in general, let's say the way I make videos, for example, and this is what I think it's pretty obvious, is designed to cope, to express, like to answer, right? The questions that I see that maybe you do not pose, but you evidently are posing for the way you interact with me. And I try my best in that sense to not to simply feed you passively with something that you can that you won't even remember, right? My task is to provoke you, not dismantling, dismantling surely some prejudice, some wrong prejudice, but at the same time showing you that there is a specific order, not dismantling something just because we have to tear down everything, but because we still have to sort out things. Overall, we know already a freaking lot of things that we are missing as a civilization, not because somebody is absolutely coming to debunk. Nobody has ever done it. It's that they're simply forgetting that they ever existed, and that they want to make you feel about it that it's some strange arbitrary notion that somebody invented in the past without any point, any base. When if you were just specialized in those fields, in history of religions, in military history, in political history, you would easily understand. You would easily, and they all do, by the way, because in these fields, what we're finding out is that they knew essentially what we know through after having abandoned the same ideas. In other words, we threw away these ideas because we thought they were owned by people that we didn't like because we were less than them and feel complex towards them. I'm talking about the Fourth Estate towards the Ancien regime. And we just had them there in our libraries. It's not something you have to dig from millennia years old. Like it's all stuff that was passed down because it was obviously the actual deal had you just had the capacity of studying it. And this is an even stronger case for not making the silly mistake of thinking that the point with historical content and simply quoting it as if the person who sees quoted had any idea of what that is in the first place, right? That's the ridiculous aspect of it all. That what we have missed are the references themselves, right? Are the firm ground to stand on, which has always remained there. as opposed to relegate people in some corners and claiming that there was nothing there to see. And this is done exactly to convince people that at the end of the day, everything is a matter of personal opinion, or that research will always change everything at the end of the day. What we thought 1,000, 2,000 years ago had nothing to do with what we know today. It's a completely different thing, right? This is what you've been told. It's a completely different thing. It's not. It's the actually same thing that you have been told falsely not to be, so that you could forget about what actually mattered and had already been sorted out. That's why we follow tradition. This is not to say, okay, well, I just like a traditional life, or just I will spend the rest of all my videos advocating for it. You know that I don't, right? I can ramble, I can make these points like I'm doing now, but I'm actually showing you with the ceaseless amount of videos that I upload and that I explain. By the way, in just right now, I see the one made yesterday starts at 11 p.m. Here in Central European time, for like about the scalar increase of the amount of artillery, 14th, 15th century. How can this be traditional in a way? Well, the way it's traditional is that I explain through doctrinal points why most of the technologistic prejudices are bullshit, for example. Why, civilizations develop the way they do. What are the political and social differences that bring to a greater or more qualitative development? What happened in a certain place, and all starting from a topic like this, which seems very technical, but at the end of the day is also very human in nature. That's the thing that I do, right? And I know that I still haven't fully passed to this sort of more aggressive style that I could, like going to chase celebrity by criticizing certain content, which would be very easy to do, telling the truth. But also should be at a level that doesn't make me insult the actual call, because I understand the sake of entertainment, and I respect that. But let's say again, what strikes me is not much what people do with their channels, but how people think that that's the only thing that can be done, or something that is worth spending their time with. And again, I think also my content is frankly boring, right? I understand it can be thought-provoking and all, but it requires a lot of time, a lot of focus. I know I ask a lot, and I'm aware of that. So that's why I don't care about celebrity in a greater sense, because I make videos to make a very specific point. The rest I don't care, right? It's a matter of conscience to a point. So to me, this can take, of course, different forms. It can be also a way to reflect on effective things that I will probably say at some point. But the general meaning of this whole thing is being ready to be honest with yourself. Like, what are your feelings when you see a video like, I don't know, what's the best sword? The award the best sword goes to 10 minutes video, and a guy with a purposely ridiculous thumbnail, and so many people watching it, and it's entertainment, yes, but something that gets a bit more moral, gets a bit more useful, a bit more practical, a bit more real. Because there is yet another point here, is that knowledge should be very much reality connected. That's why also quoting a book just per se, as I said before, misses still fails to address all what lays in between, like the capacity of a person to understand this thing, whatever it's going to be, understood by the audience. That is just instead somehow cheering for some kind of alternative views of history, etc. There's not. There's a lot of this stuff. There's a lot of, for example, historical revisionism. Right, we got legitimately upset for a long time for example, Holocaust denial, or like the minimization of casualties in the sense of victims. But let's say this is being done aside from the very topic, but basically on every other to this point, to a level which seems, as I said in the video, I don't think it's going to take over, meaning that I believe that this civilization is going to be solved by the poor, most people getting poor and working for someone, and just the very elite being educated, or at least paying for educational work of some also greater form, right, and meaning than it was before. But when it gets to, let's say, you have that's where it happens. When you trade your personal potential as a man for something soft, cheap, not demanding, doesn't require an effort, etc. That's the moment in which you give up. You're just imagining that moment in which you realize how many other people are basically making money, or just becoming successful and powerful, also independently from you, and how much you're losing in that regard. And that's, I think, the fundamental aspect of it all. You may say this stuff may be watched, for example, in moments of leisure, after a hard day of work, right? That may be the thing. But we are all aware that in this specific time, we're too indulgent with ourselves. That this is, say, what I do with this channel. It's not designed to entertain you, of course. It's designed for some educational purpose. Again, it's not a cathedratic stance I speak from when I'm here, because outside of here or in other places, I wouldn't hesitate to speak cathedratically above you, talking down to you. I already do it sometimes when I pick this generic, let's say, antagonists, and I criticize them, etc. But what I mean is that what I'm doing here on YouTube is something already, say, diluted enough for YouTube. And so I'm shocked when I see, considering all the, say, the concerns that I have for saying something that makes sense here, being engaging, whatever, how much that standard does not exist outside. This is something that has struck me ever since I was a kid. Not because I was particularly... I think my intelligence has always been pretty average overall. Like, I just maybe studied a lot, and that helps in some ways, but say I don't have super capacities of any sort, definitely. But to me, recklessness, stupidity, loud people, like the people who can't behave, can't cope, do not show courtesy, who do not know how to live among us. Just for me, to them, those were always lesser people. I've always seen them like this. Even children who didn't behave, I saw their failure as actual adults when they grow up, just as the mirror of their parents, of their background, of their, like, and you can't even say that there is a classist prejudice. I come from, say, in this sense, a socially mixed background, and I think it never, like, of course it influenced me, but it influenced me for the best because I had successful examples everywhere just because people worked and they succeeded in what they did. So whenever I see these other attitudes, I feel like, but how is it possible, like, not to see that to this extent, which I already think is pretty advanced, even for at this point in history for anyone, me included, like how much you're giving away for not just being a better person. That's somehow striking to me. So this, I don't even know how I will title this video, because it seems something dramatic enough to, let's say, to reflect on. I don't know how much of this was about actual quoting or not, but I think that I have so much to say about each one of these issues that I mixed today that I try to make a synthesis of them as well. But again, the sheer, I will probably make a video making filtering the type of content that you can find on YouTube, say just about history or the Middle Ages or whatever. And it's shocking, to say the least. I think that we need a bit of attention and a bit of seriousness, like about ourselves, because it's on us, right? I also catch myself sometimes watching videos that I think are dumb, right? And so I understand perfectly how it happens. But at the same time, I try to focus on quality. I try to focus on, say, people who are reliable just of itself. And what I find as reliability is the following, right? So I will, like, the moral of the story being, as always, that I will quote, I will refer to sources, to scholars, to whatever, but there is a level of synthesis that comes out as a wisdom after experience that you can't have up to a certain point, that cannot be understood even if you quote it. Actually, it would complicate the situation, because you would hardly find exactly what you found out correctly, even just as an intuition. I mean, how do you write articles? How do you write books? You do that because you want to find out. You don't know how it's going to turn out. This is also obvious. You do not know how it's going to be, like what you're going to find out in the process in which you research yourself. That's how history is made, right? And when you understand that the level of unknown actually is following a thread that just needs to be uncovered, and so that it is not unreliable if you actually use a scientific and moral proceeding, so that you don't just say follow intuition in the sense, I want to believe that something is this way, I will make up a story, or I will want to see in a story just that, and so I will come out and will erase with that, and it will, I will erase all the rest without any reason, right? What you have to work like is in the inverse way. You have to think that the intuition is leading you on a path when you're going to find the evidence that you need. That's how it works. And the evidence will unveil herself in front of you, and you will appreciate it. It's not something that can be done for you. You have to do it yourself in the moment in which you have to answer your question and not the one of other people. Unless you want to do. I mean, it's also your own in that regard. And I personally think it's how it's meant to work, practically, right? In history, that I know you see when I make these videos, it always feels that I'm too vague, that I'm not, say, hitting the right point in between the extremes, right? The medium, because it's such a delicate balance that if you just grossly disregard it, right, it's going to go away, per se, right? And that's why on YouTube I see even, I don't know, the new thing is making the AI graphic programs, historical thumbnails with a person who shouts dressed up in a pseudo-historical costume. I mean, when you realize that historical, say, intelligence gets down to being attracted to such display, because it's just the most basic, chthonic, again, relativistic way, emotionalistic attitude by, this video is going to be interesting because, there is a person who shouts for no reason, who looks angry, dressed up in a historical costume. What the fuck is that supposed to? How do you even hope rationally that what is contained in that video has any glimpse of intelligence? I think that this is fastly accelerating in that direction, and I think it's dangerous for YouTube itself. People may keep watching it and making the magic of it, but at a point it would be recognized that it's so dumb overall that it can't be sustained anymore, and so people will start moving away, especially those who invest, right, who think that there can be something good, let's say, in the type of just of information you can get from here. And then you don't have to be surprised if people ask so much for quotes, because they do not have any point of reference anymore. I think it's dramatic, and I don't see it actually a bright future in this regard. I think it's going to all to be somehow like lost. But I care about your insight, right? Because sometimes I think that like the historical stuff probably is good, like meaning it's not going to go down. It's always going to remain the backbone of this all. But every once in a while, video like this, when, for example, you ask something, not just like I want to see a video that is specifically about this, and that, but this, and that. I don't mean it like that, but just broader questions that you also have to show to have the courage of posing, right? From like the most, just like intuition, the most natural thing that you come up with. Like what is that you want to know in this way of how to learn yourself history, not asking me for making a video about a given topic, a historical topic just per se, right? Like unless it is something mixed, like what do you think about well, this turned out to be generic sometimes as intentions, but say something of the degree of what you think about modernity, for example, is very, very general. But let's say, what do you think about, I don't know, this historical topic, this war, this campaign, this historical figure in the moment of transition, like from tradition to modernity, or how much tradition there is actually in modernity, which is actually a very overlooked topic and issue in the first place, that the only possible thing that, as I was saying, it's possible to stand on qualitatively is tradition, or at least what has been consolidated as such for the reasons we explained. If you think to simply live in modernity as such, it's because you are part of the failure, that you can't recognize anymore that this is the world in which we are living is not a cleared one from the let's say the topics that let's say the issues, the values that existed before, but something actually much more close to it than you can imagine. Alright, well, for today I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.